For too long, marking the death of Jesus on Good Friday has meant wallowing in a collective guilt based on the deeply flawed notion of original sin. Somber services emphasize gory theological interpretations that are more a benefit to the institutional church than the individual follower of Jesus. Our reflections today are by the Reverend James Cox, adapted from the writings of Michael Morwood and alternating with readings from the Gospels. Our hope is that these meditations will help you connect with a Jesus who knew the longings and pains of the human heart. As we remember the man, may we embrace a Good Friday that is less about guilt and more about reverence, honoring one who was as human as we are, but who modeled being faithful to his convictions, no matter the cost.
In hope and in longing.
We're moved to mark this day.
In solidarity with those who struggle.
We're moved to mark this day.
In resistance to those who dominate.
We're moved to mark this day.
In memory of Jesus, who lived with compassion.
We're moved to mark this day.
In memory of all who act with courage.
We're moved to mark this day.
This reading is from the 23rd chapter of Luke, verses 1 through 5. The whole assembly got up and led Jesus to Pilate and began to accuse him. They said, "We have found this man misleading our people, opposing the payment of taxes to Caesar and claiming that he is the Christ, a king." Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus replied, "That's what you say." Then Pilate said to the chief priests in the crowd, "I find no legal basis for action against this man." But they objected strenuously, saying, "He agitates the people with his teaching throughout Judea, starting from Galilee and all the way here."
I remember a man who proclaimed the coming kingdom of God, in which there is good news for the poor. The captives are set free. The blind regain sight, and the oppressed go free. He proclaimed the year of the Lord's favor, envisioning the dignity and worth of all people, a restoration of power to the powerless, a day of peace and well-being for all who suffer under the weight of those in authority over them. I remember a man whose love for the poor and the oppressed so threatened the powerful of his day that they fabricated stories about him. They transformed half-truths into indictable charges of treason, insurrection, and demagoguery. The fear of his influence with those who must be kept in line led them to seek the destruction of his authority, regardless of what was true or right. I remember a man whose acts of love agitated people to want compassion and justice for everyone in this world. I remember a man who invited his followers to fight injustice, even at great personal risk.
Lesson from the Gospel of Luke in the 23rd chapter and the 6th through the 12th verses. Hearing this, Pilate asked if the man was a Galilean. When he learned that Jesus was from Herod's district, Pilate sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. Herod was very glad to see Jesus, for he had heard about Jesus and had wanted to see him for some time. He was hoping to see Jesus perform some sign. Herod questioned Jesus at length, but Jesus didn't respond to him. The chief priests and the legal experts were there, fiercely accusing Jesus. Herod and his soldiers treated Jesus with contempt. Herod mocked him by dressing Jesus in elegant clothes and sent him back to Pilate. Pilate and Herod became friends with each other that day. Before this, they had been enemies.
I remember a man who was a faithful and a devout Jew, who never intended to start a new religion. I remember a man who came from humble beginnings in a hick town. He never denied who he was, even after his rise to great popularity. I remember a man whose fame resulted from authoritative teaching, from amazing acts of insight, from the love and acceptance of marginalized people whose sickness and social estrangement defined them as needy. I remember a man whose identity was fixed in divine compassion and who suffered the ridicule of those who viewed God's love as a weakness. I remember a man who invited his followers to walk in the footsteps of the oppressed people of the world.
A reading from Luke 23, verses 13 to 24. Jesus and Barabbas. Then Pilate called together the chief priests, the rulers of the people. He said to them, "You brought this man before me as one who was misleading the people. I have questioned him in your presence and found nothing in this man's conduct that provides a legal basis for the charges you have brought against him. Neither did Herod, because Herod returned him to us. He's done nothing that deserves death. Therefore, I'll have him whipped. Then let him go." But with one voice they shouted, "Away with this man! Release Barabbas to us!" Barabbas had been thrown in prison because of a riot that had occurred in the city, and for murder. Pilate addressed them again because he wanted to release Jesus. They kept shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" For the third time, Pilate said to them, "Why? What wrong has he done? I've found no legal basis for the death penalty in this case. Therefore, I will have him whipped, then let him go." But they were adamant, shouting their demand that Jesus be crucified. Their voices won out. Pilate issued his decision to grant their request. He released the one they had asked for, who had been thrown into prison because of riot and murder. But he handed Jesus over to their will.
I remember a man who lived without blame, whose experience of the divine resulted in the best and highest level of human conduct. I remember a man whose humanity is truly worth emulating in our lives. I remember a man who was willing to suffer with every innocent person, even though, ironically, the guilty who have committed great evil go free. I remember a man whose presence with the divine remained sure while standing before an angry, accusing and torturous, death-demanding mob. I remember a man who invited his followers to live in divine grace, even when faced with unreasonable anger and impending personal violence.
Luke 23, verses 26 through 31. On the way to the cross. As they led Jesus away, they grabbed Simon, a man from Cyrene who was coming in from the countryside. They put the cross on his back and made him carry it behind Jesus. A huge crowd of people followed Jesus, including women who were mourning and wailing for him. Jesus turned to the women and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, don't cry for me. Rather cry for yourselves and your children. The time will come when they will say, 'Happy are those who are unable to become pregnant, the wombs that never gave birth, and the breasts that never nursed a child.' Then they will say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' If they do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry?"
I remember a man who could graciously accept the help and gifts of others when he reached his limits. I remember a man who, despite great personal pain and suffering, looked outward and upward to the greater needs of others. I remember a man whose commitment to God's work could not be taken away, no matter the cost or the world's attempts to distract or divert.
I remember a man who faced the truth even when it was not pleasant. He did not hide his eyes or turn his head or pretend it wasn't there. He saw the truth, he spoke the truth, regardless of what others wanted to hear. He demonstrated time and again that the hope for change only comes when we look at and understand what should be or should not be.
I remember a man who invited his followers to live with hope while facing hard realities.
Lesson from the Gospel of Luke, the 23rd chapter, beginning with the 32nd verse. They also led two other criminals to be executed with Jesus. When they arrived at the place called the Skull, they crucified him along with the criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing." They drew lots as a way of dividing up his clothing. The people were standing around watching, but the leaders sneered at him, saying, "He saved others, let him save himself, if he really is the Christ, sent from God, the chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him. They came up to him, offering him sour wine and saying, "If you really are the King of the Jews, save yourself." Above his head was a notice of the formal charge against him. It read, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals hanging next to Jesus insulted him. "Aren't you the Christ? Save yourself and us." Responding, the other criminal spoke harshly to him. "Don't you fear God, seeing that you've also been sentenced to die? We are rightly condemned, for we are receiving the appropriate sentence for what we did. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus replied, "I assure you that today you will be with me in paradise."
I remember a man whose capacity to forgive others was truly divine. I remember a man who did not use his authority or power for his own gain at the expense of others. He did not grasp or use power for self-exaltation, but used power for the nurturing of all people, which was not limited just to the people he loved or cared for. I remember a man who, despite his own personal suffering, remained one with God. I remember a man who invited his followers to remain one with God and one with God's purpose, no matter what their own personal circumstances were.
It was now about noon, and darkness covered the whole earth until about 3 o'clock, while the sun stopped shining. Then the curtain in the sanctuary tore down the middle. Crying out in a loud voice, Jesus said, "Father, into your hands I entrust my life." After he said this, he breathed for the last time. When the centurion saw what had happened, he praised God, saying, "It's really true. This man was righteous." All the crowds who had come together to see the event returned to their homes, beating their chests after seeing what had happened. And everyone who knew him, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance observing these things.
I remember a man whose experiences of the divine spirit led him always to trust himself to God's care. I remember a man whose strength of life impacted the whole of creation around him. I remember a man who lived to connect, renew, and reconcile humanity to the divine spirit. I remember a man who was so alive that he chose when to die. I remember a man whose suffering happened for all to see, so that we would understand what love is about. I remember a man who invited his followers to die with him, so that we might truly live.
Luke chapter 23, verses 50 through 56. Jesus' burial. Now there was a man named Joseph, who was a member of the council. He was a good and righteous man. He hadn't agreed with the plan and the actions of the council. He was from the Jewish city of Arimathea and eagerly anticipated God's kingdom. This man went to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Taking it down, he wrapped it in a linen cloth and laid it in a tomb carved out of the rock, in which no one had ever been buried. It was the preparation day for the Sabbath, and the Sabbath was quickly approaching. The women who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed Joseph. They saw the tomb and how Jesus' body was laid in it. Then they went away and prepared fragrant spices and perfumed oils. They rested on the Sabbath in keeping with the commandment.
I remember a man whose message transcended political and religious groups. For those who had eyes to see and ears to hear, it didn't matter where you came from or who you were supposed to hate or keep at a distance. I remember a man who proclaimed the kingdom of God. I remember a man who died so that hope would rise eternal in the human spirit. I remember a man who invited his followers to keep the commandment of God that we love one another as he has loved us.
As each of us resonates with different aspects of these readings, let us commend each other to the sustaining presence of the Spirit.
We believe in the mystery of life all around us. When there was nothing but an ocean of tears, God sighed over the waters and dreamed a small dream, light in the darkness, a planet in space.
We believe in God beside us, Jesus as the Christ, dream made flesh. When hate and fear were raging, when love was beaten down, when hope was nailed and left to die, the Spirit of Christ enters in to the deepest parts of who we are.
We believe in God within us, a Spirit that empowers the dream, who weeps with us in our despair,
who breathes on prison doors, never admitting it's hopeless, always expecting the bars to bend and sway and break forth into blossom.
Now, may we go in peace and hope, for nothing can separate us from the source of life and love. We are an Easter people! Woo!